Take a look at some of history's most renowned musical artists. For example, Robert Johnson, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse. What do they all have in common besides their incredible musical skills? Well, they all died. And more specifically, they all died at age 27. The infamous 27 Club is soaked in mystery and intrigue. There have actually been studies that show that there's no statistical probability of dying more at age 27 than any other age, really. But still, there's something just a little uncanny about the whole thing. So today, let's dive a little deeper and see if we can possibly uncover the truth behind the dreaded 27 Club. Before we really hop into it, I do need to give a viewer discretion warning here. Obviously, we're talking about death. That's the whole thing with this channel. But today's topics are going to get really heavy. So if you are sensitive to things like addiction, we're going to be talking a lot about substance abuse, alcoholism. If that is not something that you want to be privy to, I understand. I do want to let you know as well that we are going to be talking about topics of both self-harm, overdoses, suicide, things like that. Please take care of yourself. I am going to leave a few resources down in the description. If you need somebody to talk to, please use those resources. Please, please, please. I love you. Smooches, smooches. Let's get into the video. Robert Johnson is said to be one of the first members of the 27 Club. He was born in Mississippi into a sharecropping family in 1911, and at a young age, he relocated to Tennessee with his family, and while he was in school, he started learning and picking up music. He and his family eventually moved back to Mississippi, and there he met a 14-year-old girl named Virginia Travis. They fell in love, they got married, and also got pregnant. But unfortunately, during childbirth, both Virginia and the baby passed away. This life-shattering event obviously changed the course of Robert's life forever. He put the idea of being a family man behind him and started playing guitar and singing at the local juke joints. So juke joints were incredibly popular, especially in the southeastern part of America back in the day. It would have, drinking, dancing, but it would also have gambling and live music. So it was really an important place to be back in the day, okay? And Robert, when he played at these gigs, he was incredibly passionate, but he honestly wasn't any good. One musician named Sam House was actually quoted saying that the audience were telling him to take the guitar away from that boy and get him off the stage. That's how bad he was, okay? But then one day, he suddenly disappeared from the area, and nobody really knew where he was. They just knew that he wasn't playing at these juke joints anymore. 18 months went by, and suddenly Robert reemerged from the mist. And when he took the stage at the juke joint, that same musician, Sam House, said that everyone's mouths were hanging open when he was done playing. He had gotten so good, seemingly overnight, and people were just in awe of his new talent. Rumors obviously kind of started to swirl around this, and some people truly believed that Robert Johnson traveled out to a crossroads and met the devil and traded his soul for his unmatched musical talent. And honestly, some of Robert's lyrics didn't help his case because, for example, in one song called Crossroads, it talks about how a guy named Bob turned away from the Lord and sunk down, presumably to hell. Another tune called Me and the Devil Blues literally has the lyrics, "Hello, Satan, it's time to go. Me and the devil was walking side by side." So I can understand why some people were like, this man sold his soul. It's gone. It's gone. He sounds amazing. I want to keep listening, but something's a little weird. Something's a little fishy about all of this. Robert's family later said that no, when he was gone for those 18 months, he was just practicing with some of the best blues musicians of the day, not with the big fiery man downstairs, but of course, people like to take things and run with it, and it does make for a pretty good story. So anyway, with Robert's updated skills, he began to travel and tour around the United States, playing with different musicians, having a good old time. What made him so unique is that he had that thing that some artists have where they can just hear any tune and then play it and make it their own.
And he took inspiration from, of course, blues, but also jazz and ragtime and country. The way that he played his guitar just made this new sound that was so incredible. And then, of course, there's his lyrics, his singing voice. When I listen to it, I almost get this eerie feeling because there's just so much raw emotion. You can feel the sadness or the anger or the happiness that he's feeling just by listening to a song, which I think is sometimes rare. So, of course, he was pretty popular when he traveled around, and his music lives on to this day, of course, as well. Robert ultimately made his way back to Greenwood, Mississippi, and he again started to play at the local jute joints, and he especially liked one called the Three Forks Store. And that is what brings us to August 16th of 1938. On this day, Robert Johnson passed away at age 27. And ever since, his death has been shrouded in mystery. Although some people believe that he passed away from congenital syphilis, others think that there was something a bit more malicious going on. A musician named Sonny Boy Williamson said that on that night, Robert was at a bar flirting with a married woman when she offered him an opened bottle of whiskey. And Sonny Boy, being smart, slapped the bottle away from Robert, being like, "You're a dum-dum. Do not drink open bottles from people you do not know." But all this did was piss Robert off because he was kind of a heavy drinker and he would get a little bit violent at times. So he was like, "Don't tell me what to do." And so then the woman offered him a second bottle of whiskey and he took it and drank from it. He was soon plagued with abdominal pain, vomiting, bleeding from his mouth, and within the same day, he had died. People think that this married woman, this wife, and her husband schemed to kill Robert Johnson because the husband was jealous, which there's a lot of plot holes in this. And additionally, a musicologist named Mac McCormick said that he got a confession from this husband, although he never named any names. So this theory is kind of up in the air, and although I think a lot of people want it to be something gross and grotesque, I'm not really sure if that's what actually killed Robert Johnson. Who's to say? Another unique theory that I never even thought of was that Robert Johnson had something called Marfan syndrome. This is an illness that affects the proteins that make up our connective tissue. So people that have Marfan syndrome often have elongated limbs, digits, and also sometimes heart problems. The doctor that first brought up this theory did note that Robert had an interesting body type, and this might have actually been why he was so good at guitar, because he had these long fingers that were able to reach all the different strings, all the different frets, all that good stuff. But also, it might have caused a tear in his heart, which ultimately caused his death. While Robert Johnson's cause of death is often disputed, it is no question how he influenced a lot of the music that we listen to today. For example, Led Zeppelin, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton. All of these people took a huge amount of influence from Robert Johnson, and it is kind of no wonder that he is one of the first famous people in our 27 club. Let's jump forward now to 1964 in sunny Los Angeles, where a young man named Jim Morrison had just transferred to UCLA. He was studying film, but his true passion was poetry. In 1965, Jim graduated and he was living the dream in Venice Beach. He was living on a rooftop with a bunch of people, writing his poetry, doing some drugs, and it was here that he met keyboard player Ray Manzarek. The pair, along with guitarist Robbie Krieger and drummer John Desmond, formed the incredible band The Doors around this time. In January of 1967, the band signed on with Elektra Records, and they produced and released their first self-titled album. But it was really their second single, Light My Fire, that skyrocketed them into the limelight. They had this strange psychedelic feeling to their music, and I think a lot of it came from the organ and keyboard that was used, but they also had this kind of like rough bluesy feel to it too, which just made it super interesting, along with, of course, Jim Morrison's kind of cryptic lyrics and interesting singing voice. It was just unlike a lot of the music at the time. So from 1967 to 1971, the band continued to release albums. They were growing in popularity, but unfortunately, Jim's already rampant drug and alcohol problem just continued to ramp up during this time, and this made his temper problem worse as well. According to John, the drummer of The Doors, he said that on the outside, Jim seemed normal, but on the inside, he had an aggression towards life and towards women. There is one infamous story that I want to talk about, and this happened backstage before a show in New Haven, Connecticut. Jim was making out with this girl. They were, getting their freak on, and a security guard came by and was like, dude, you gotta leave, because he didn't realize who this guy was. He didn't realize that he was supposed to be protecting him. He just thought it was like a random couple. When Jim was like, no, I'm not leaving the backstage of my own concert, the security guard pepper sprayed Jim Morrison. And he was like, the fuck, bro? Uncalled for, 0 to 100 really fast. But they still ended up playing, although they went on stage a little bit late. Things seemed to be okay until they got to their song Backdoor Man, and Jim Morrison went into this long-winded, profanity-streaked rant against police officers. Which, okay, go off, queen. I understand why he was upset. The police stormed on stage and arrested Jim Morrison in the middle of his fucking concert. And this, riled the crowd up because they didn't know what was going on. And I think if any of us were fans of a band and we saw the singer get arrested, we would be like, what the fuck? Jim was originally charged with public obscenity, indecency, and inciting a riot. But these charges were thankfully later dropped because they had no, basis. When everybody knew the full story, it was like, why'd you pepper spray the guy? You know what I mean? But I think that this little story totally encapsulates the person that Jim Morrison was. He wasn't gonna put up with bullshit, and he was gonna let people know, how he actually felt. During 1968, his band members started to notice that Jim was becoming more attached to drugs and alcohol than ever before. He was showing up late to performances. He was showing up late to recording sessions. He seemed to be becoming more detached from reality and more into his addiction. His physical appearance became more scraggly, and he was actually charged with public indecency at a performance in 1969. So because of all of these reasons, the band decided to take a break, and they ultimately reconvened in 1971. That same year, Jim and his longtime partner Pamela Corson decided to move to Paris, France. He just needed a reset, both physically, mentally, creatively, and this seemed like the perfect place to do that. The Doors had just finished recording their newest album, Alley Woman, and according to keyboardist Ray, Jim was hitting the alcohol pretty hard at this point. Ray later recounted that, in photos, you can see the impending demise of Jim Morrison. He was sitting down because he was drunk. A psychic would have known that this guy was on his way out. There was a great weight on him. He wasn't the youthful poet I met on the beach in Venice. That being said, his Paris getaway seemed to be helping a little bit because he was writing again, he was getting back in shape. But unfortunately, things quickly went back downhill for Jim Morrison. On July 3rd of 1971, Jim Morrison's body was found in the bathtub of his apartment at around 6 a.m. He was dead at age 27. The official cause of death is listed as heart failure, although an autopsy was never performed because French officials didn't see any foul play, so they didn't think it was necessary. Although authorities considered this a shut-and-done case, the true cause of death has long been speculated. The main theory is that Jim Morrison died of a heroin overdose in a Paris nightclub. The manager of this alleged nightclub later stated that Jim fell unconscious in the bathroom of the club around 2 a.m. and was dragged out by his drug dealers. It's then thought that the dealers took Jim back to his apartment, placed him in his bathtub, and that is where he was later found. But there is not a whole lot of evidence to back this theory up, although it is a popular one that a lot of people think could definitely be plausible. Another more obscure theory is that Jim mistook Pamela's stash of heroin for coke and ended up snorting it, although there is no evidence to back this up that I could find, so I don't know. One last and more optimistic theory that some people have is that Jim Morrison faked his own death and that he is living a more quiet lifestyle, maybe somewhere in a European countryside. I think we all hope that that is the case, but unfortunately, again, we will never truly know the real cause of Jim Morrison's death. When we think about the 1960s, what do we feel? What do we think about? Maybe it's free love, hippies, psychedelics, or of course, Woodstock. There were a lot of crazy talented musicians at the time, and one of the most popular in that era is our next entry into the 27th Club. Let's talk about Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix grew up being obsessed with the greats like B.B. King, Robert Johnson, Buddy Holly. He got a guitar at a pretty young age and started to teach himself how to play. And what I think is crazy is that this man never learned how to read or write with sheet music. He got to start playing at different little venues in Greenwich Village, and this is where he was noticed and picked up by the Animals bassist, Chaz Chandler. He relocated to London in 1967 and formed the group Jimi Hendrix Experience, and together they released their first few albums called Are You Experienced and Axis, Bold as Love. With these releases, they quickly gained popularity in the UK, but they decided to hop the pond and played at the Monterey International Music Festival, and this skyrocketed their popularity in North America as well. His music was unlike any other, and I think that this was due to the heavy use of distortion and pedals in his music. And not only that, but he was totally open to experimenting with different techniques and sounds and genres. Once the band got back to America, they hit the ground running. And more specifically, Jimi Hendrix was working all the time. He opened his own recording studio, Electric Lady Studios. They released their album, Electric Ladyland. They were touring all over the place. And then in 1969, the band officially decided to split up. And that same summer, the summer of '69, was when Jimi Hendrix performed on that final rainy day of Woodstock and had that incredible rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. Life went on and Jimi Hendrix was working in overdrive 24/7, and it was said that in the week leading up to his death, he was very unwell. He was not doing well. He was fighting a cold, but he was also just never sleeping and overworking himself to the bone. Not only that, but for some time, he had been feeling this dissatisfaction with his manager, Michael Jeffrey. And it was to the point where Jimi was actively looking for a new manager. It had gotten that bad.
This brings us to September 17th of 1970, and Jimi was staying with his new girlfriend, Monica, in her apartment in London. On the 16th, the couple went to an acquaintance's house for a couple hours, and then they returned back to Monica's apartment. And then in the early hours of the 17th, Jimi was driven by Monica to a friend's house for about an hour and 15 minutes, and then they returned again back to Monica's apartment. The couple then stayed awake talking until about 6 a.m., and Monica later stated that Jimi was still awake when she fell asleep. Monica then woke up around 10 a.m., went out to buy some cigarettes, and when she left, she noted that Jimi was sleeping pretty soundly, but when she returned from her run to the store, she realized that Jimi was not sleeping, but was unconscious. She frantically called around to all of Jimi's friends, seeing if anybody knew who his doctor was, and when she made a call to one of Jimi's friends, a man named Eric Burden, he obviously told her, hang up and call 911, what are you doing? Paramedics quickly rushed to Monica's apartment. They got there around 11:30 and took Jimi to the hospital, but it was too late, and Jimi was officially pronounced dead at 12:45 on September 18th of 1970. The doctor stated that when Jimi arrived to the hospital, he was not in good shape, and this is not too surprising just because of the things we talked about earlier. He was working a lot, but also he, had used a lot of drugs throughout his life. Things like weed, psychedelics, amphetamines, alcohol, all of those things. And I'm not justifying it, but it kind of was a normal thing for the time period. People were experimenting with different kinds of drugs and things like that. But sometimes Jimi would get violent or angry when he was drunk. And towards the end of his life, it was becoming more apparent. It was affecting both his performances and also his life behind the scenes. There were a few times that he became violent. One time he punched his hand through a window, busted his hand up, and then another time he hit his former girlfriend in the head with a bottle. Like so many of the artists that we talked about today, he had an addiction. So anyways, an autopsy was performed on Jimi Hendrix, and it was thought that he died most likely from asphyxia caused by a barbiturate overdose. Although it was never really cemented, it was left as an open verdict. An open verdict basically means that the medical examiner was like, yes, a death occurred, this is true, but we don't know for sure how it happened, which seems like kind of a cop-out. Like, there should be a definite answer. While it is a little bit sketchy, this does seem to be the most widely accepted theory, just because Monica later stated that she had some prescribed sleeping pills and that 9 of them were missing after Jimi had overdosed. And taking 9 of the pills would be 18 times the normal dose, so it unfortunately makes sense that he would have died in this way. Some, however, were very suspicious of Monica because every time she retold the events of that day, it was changing, it was fluctuating. For example, she stated many times that she rode in the ambulance with Jimi to the hospital, but the paramedics not only said that she was not in the ambulance, but she was not in the apartment when they found Jimi. One paramedic was even quoted as saying that when they arrived at the apartment, the door was just flung open and Jimi's body was there, but there was no other person in that apartment. And then, of course, there was this other fishy person, Jimi Hendrix's manager, Michael Jeffrey. Apparently, he had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy on Jimi Hendrix, and Jeffrey was the sole beneficiary of it all. And for all my true crime fans out there, we know that whenever somebody takes out a life insurance policy, that insurance company is going to look into it. But because it was determined an open verdict for Jimi Hendrix's death, the insurance company just immediately paid out. Some people obviously believe that Michael Jeffrey had a lot of motivation to kill Jimi Hendrix. Of course, if he knew that Jimi was dissatisfied with the work that he was doing, maybe he thought it would be easier to kill Jimi Hendrix than to try to find another cash cow. In fact, there's actually a book written by one of Jimi Hendrix's old groupies that said that Michael Jeffrey actually confessed to this man that he killed Jimi Hendrix. Although I don't think this theory holds a lot of water, simply for the fact that it later came out that this man basically made up this entire story. Fast forward to 1992, and two private investigators decided to take the case into their own hands and gather more evidence and try to make a clearer picture of what actually happened on that day. The owner of the apartment stated that when Jimi and Monica were over at his house, that Jimi was actually flirting with a different girl, and Monica got super upset and they started fighting, and that actually is the reason why they left the acquaintance's house. Then, in the early hours of the 18th, when Monica came to pick Jimi up from his friend's house, Jimi had actually told his friend to get rid of Monica, and this made her really upset, obviously. So again, they started to fight. So it's pretty obvious that that day was kind of tumultuous for the couple. They were fighting quite a bit and things like that. The investigators also uncovered that when Monica called Eric Burden that day, she had told him that she was scared to call the paramedics because she had drugs in the apartment. Eric evidently had one of his friends come over to Monica's apartment, and together they decided to go to a nearby garden and bury the stash of drugs. And this, of course, makes sense with the fact that when the paramedics came in, they found Jimi all alone. Monica was nowhere to be seen, and this was because she was out with a friend hiding her drugs. The private investigators brought all of this newfound evidence to authorities in hopes that they would reopen the coroner's inquest. And Scotland Yard actually launched a very full-scale investigation, re-going over the interviews and the evidence that they had. And after a couple months, they did determine that this new evidence wasn't strong enough to reopen the case, and they stated that too much time had passed, and it also wouldn't benefit the public to dig any deeper. Which, okay, I understand. They probably didn't want to waste the public's resources having it go to this case that is basically solved. But at the same time, it's imagine if that was your son. The reopening of the case in 1992 does bring a lot of new evidence forward, and it does make Monica look a little bit suspicious. But at the same time, I think it's important that we realize that this was a woman who was quite obviously on some drugs. She might have gone into shock when she realized that Jimi had passed away. And I think that this would explain a lot why maybe her story fluctuates quite a bit. Maybe there's some gaps in her memory. And it's also important, I think, that we realize that this was a white woman dating a black, very popular musical artist. I think the pressure on her was probably quite a bit. Not that that justifies anything, but I'm just saying I don't think that she had anything to do with Jimi Hendrix's death. The evidence is quite circumstantial. I think it just doesn't add up. I truly believe that this is a tragic case of an overworked, taken advantage of musical genius that accidentally overdosed. Again, although it's not the most exciting story, I think it is the truth. Our last story starts in Washington State with a teenager named Kurt Cobain. He had recently dropped out of high school just a mere few weeks before graduation and had gotten kicked out of the house. But even though he had these setbacks early in his life, he was extremely passionate about his music, And he played with different bands until he met a bassist named Chris Novoselic in 1987, and they formed the band Nirvana. The band released their first album called Bleach in 1989, and during this time they had a drummer named Chad Channing, but he was soon let go just because of creative and stylistic differences, and that is when we get our more famous drummer, Dave Grohl, as the new drummer of the band. Kurt met his wife, Courtney Love, at a show in Portland, Oregon in 1989, and they got married the following year. By the end of 1990, Kurt Cobain was fully into his heroin addiction. It's a well-known fact that he was a heroin addict, but it was stated that he used heroin to kind of numb the pain that he was having. He had stomach problems since he was a kid, and that seemed to be the only thing that would help his stomach problems. But also, he was into drugs at a pretty young age. He started smoking weed when he was 13. He dabbled in LSD, inhalants, all that kind of stuff. So drugs were just kind of a part of Kurt's life. So anyway, in 1991, Nirvana released probably their most popular album called Nevermind, and this threw Kurt Cobain directly into the spotlight. He and his bandmates were the faces of grunge music. And while that was amazing for the genre and alt-rock in general, Kurt Cobain himself hated that he was famous, hated that he was popular. And I think a lot of it came from the misinterpretation of his art. And I think partially because of all of this is why he started to slowly pull away from his bandmates and started hanging out with a new group of people that happened to be really into drugs, just like him. So in 1992, Nirvana went on the Nevermind tour, and this is when his addiction to heroin just really ramped up, like a lot. That year, 1992, also marked Kurt Cobain's first overdose. Thankfully, Courtney was there and able to resuscitate him, but then the next year in 1993, before he was about to go on stage in New York, he again overdosed, and again, thankfully, Courtney was there and she was able to give him Narcan and resuscitate him, and he actually still went on stage that night and performed like nothing happened. In the fall of 1993, Nirvana started on their world tour of their newest album, In Utero, and then on March 1st of 1994 marked the very last performance of Nirvana, and that happened in Munich, Germany. During Nirvana's second to last live performance, Kurt's voice went out like halfway through the show, and so he obviously went to the doctor and he was diagnosed with bronchitis and a severe case of laryngitis. And honestly, he had been feeling pretty unwell prior to this new medical discovery. His stomach problems were worse than ever, and he had actually confided in his wife that he was feeling extremely down and that he hated the world and everyone in it. All of these different concerning factors made Courtney decide to hop on a plane and meet Kurt in Rome on March 3rd. The following day, Courtney awoke to find Kurt unconscious, and he was quickly rushed to the hospital where it was determined that he had purposely tried to overdose on a mixture of barbiturates and champagne. After recovering for about 5 days in Rome, the couple flew back to Seattle, and then just a few weeks later, Courtney called the police, begging them to come help to stop another attempt by Kurt. Evidently, he had locked himself in a room with multiple firearms and a bottle of pills. The situation was just not good. Thankfully, the officers got there in time. They were able to de-escalate the situation, but Kurt denied that he was trying to take his own life during this little incident that happened. All of these recent events caused Courtney to hold an intervention for Kurt, and evidently he reacted a little bit violently to the whole situation, which is not unheard of, but he did ultimately agree to go to rehab. He was admitted to a facility in Los Angeles on March 30th of 1994, but after just one day, he decided to escape the facility without telling any of his friends or family and flew back to Seattle. By April 2nd, Courtney discovered that Kurt was not at the rehab facility anymore, so she decided to hire a private investigator to try to hunt down Kurt. And at the same time, Kurt's mom decided to file a missing persons report. Unfortunately, though, there was no news until April 8th of 1994. An electrician had made his way over to the Cobain house to try to install some new security lights, and when he made his way over to the greenhouse that was above the garage, he found Kurt. There was a handwritten note addressed to one of Kurt's imaginary friends that he had from his childhood named Boda, and a 20-gauge shotgun was found laying on Kurt's chest. The firearm was later discovered to have been purchased by one of Kurt's friends, and this was because all of Kurt's personal firearms had been taken away by the police officers because they feared for his safety. The coroner found out that Kurt had been high on heroin and Valium when he had taken his own life, and that the event had happened on April 5th. The public reacted much in the way that you would assume that they would. Nirvana's music sales skyrocketed after this event, and in fact, Nevermind album sales increased about 200% after Kurt died. Fans of the band had always felt close to Kurt. Maybe it was his utter realness, the way that he portrayed himself through his music, that raw emotion. People just mourned for him because they just felt him. They felt like they knew him. There are lots of quotes from fellow musicians at the time. Some say that they saw the signs. Others say that they wish they could have helped. And of course, with anyone who passes away that's in the limelight, the theories around his death begin to swirl. One of the first theories surrounding Kurt's death had to do with the amount of heroin found in his body. The toxicology report stated that the amount of morphine found within his system was about 1.52 milligrams per liter. And if you didn't know, because I had no idea, when heroin is in the body, it turns into what we call morphine. So there was morphine found in his system because he took heroin. The real conspiracy and disputes came from whether this was the total amount of morphine or the free amount of morphine in his system. The total amount of a drug is how much stays in your system more on a long-term basis, whereas the free amount of a drug is the kind of like unused, undigested molecules of the drug that are just in your system, and this is shortly after you take a drug. The fatal dose of free morphine is about 0.12 milligrams per liter, so conspiracy theorists said that there was no way that Kurt had that amount of free morphine in his system and also had the ability to fire a gun at the same time. So people said that this meant that Kurt was killed. There was no way he could have even attempted to take his own life. But what I think is more likely is that the toxicology report is talking about the total amount of morphine, and the fatal amount of total morphine is much higher than that 0.12 milligrams per liter. So I think that although Kurt had a lot of morphine and heroin in his system, he was probably still able to fire a gun just because he was an addict. His tolerance was probably extremely high to begin with. Courtney's involvement in Kurt's death has always been a very popular conspiracy theory. Some believe that she was just looking for a monetary gain, and Kurt's death would give her just that. Rumors were talking about how they were going to maybe get a divorce, how the band was breaking up, and how Kurt had recently turned down a Lollapalooza gig that would have paid a lot of money. So some people think that Courtney killed Kurt to maybe get some sort of life insurance policy, something along those lines. But again, I don't think that this theory holds up, and I think it's a kind of cruel theory to have, honestly, because from all I could tell, Courtney and Kurt were in love. They had a daughter together. Like, yes, their relationship was rocky because they were both rock stars, they were both addicted to drugs, but it seemed like they truly loved each other. So I do not like this theory. Our last theory is that the scene of the crime was actually staged to simply look like a suicide. According to the Seattle PD, Kurt was found with the firearm in his right hand, on his chest, of course, and then there was a empty shell casing on the left side of his body on the ground. Conspiracy theorists obviously think that the shell casing should be on the right side of Kurt's body, and this is what leads them to believe that this whole entire scene had been poorly staged. That being said, authorities hired an expert to look into this theory, and what was determined is that the barrel of the gun was probably being held at the time that it fired, which caused the gun to rotate about 180 degrees, which meant that the shell casing was going in the proper direction, but it was the gun that had actually turned before he died. Sometimes the truth is the most cruel and the hardest thing to accept. And I think in this case, it was truly just a very pained, hurting man with a lot of unresolved issues. And the evidence lines up with this. Kurt has a family history of suicides. In fact, his great aunt, his great grandfather, and two of his great uncles actually either attempted or completed suicide. The facts don't lie. He had chronic pain. He was thrown into stardom, a fate that he did not want. The cards were just stacked against him. After Kurt Cobain's death, his mother was quoted in a local newspaper saying, "Now he's gone and joined that stupid club. I told him not to join that stupid club." And I think that's a good place to leave off. You might believe that some unknown force guided these certain individuals to their legendary musical heights. Or it may be stress, drugs, and alcohol that caused irreversible damage. There's something so eerie and tragic about the 27th Club. Careers left too early, lives ripped from us too soon. It's sad, but I think that's the reality of the 27 Club. That was kind of heavy, huh? I'm sorry. I was trying to kick off our spooky month real exciting but I had to talk about this story. I just think it's crazy. It's something that I've wanted to talk about since I started the channel. So I hope that you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys are ready for some spooky time. I am going to do some fun videos, I promise, but I just couldn't let this one slip between my fingers, so I hope that you guys enjoyed. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe if you're interested. It would mean a lot. Who is your favorite musical artist? They don't have to be in the 27th Club, but what's your favorite? I think mine's either Jimi Hendrix or Janis Joplin, which I did not talk about, but they're some of my favorites, and I don't know. I think it's like a sad thing, but it's also so incredible that in such a short amount of time, a lot of these artists just had like crazy good music, and they just like kicked out all of this great material. But yeah, I hope that you guys enjoyed. I will be talking to you real soon. Keep being the bad bitches that you are. Bye, guys.